Jonas Jägermeyr. Just came over from Germany, from PIC, Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, now on a postdoc appointment through University of Chicago, but working here at NASA GISS with Joshua Elliott and Alex Rain and Cynthia, many other people on the AgMed team, and particularly on the GGCMI, the Global Gridded Crop Model Intercomparison. And today I thought it's a great opportunity to present some of my previous work, so that I've been working on last year during my PhD that I gained at PIC, and to rather give you more broad and a little bit more context, a little bit more of introduction and discussion than presenting my latest development here. I plan on speaking maybe 35 to 40 minutes and leave some room for discussions. Whenever you guys have questions, just come up. Yeah, so under the title, Assessing Opportunities to Increase Global Food Production Within the Safe Space for Human Freshwater Use. I want to look at the potential, the worldwide potential of agricultural water management to intensify global production in the view of Sustainable Development Goals. To understand better the historical pressure on agriculture and water resources, just want to give a brief start, brief introduction of the historical human race for food, right? So with the shift from foraging to farming, the Neolithic Revolution, some people say it's the largest cultural step up in human history. Humanity started out to implement a long series of pivotal achievements that again and again stretched food abundance and the number of people to survive. So it's kind of in this mind frame that neither oil or water, but human ingenuity is the ultimate resource. So, but in this worldview neglects that food production is associated with environmental consequences at the very same pace, right? The Green Revolution that tripled crop yields around the world have never been possible without massive appropriations of new resources and often unrenewable resources, here as illustrated through the irrigated area and associated human water use. So humanity has actually altered the hydrologic cycle to the degree that 25% of rivers no longer reach the oceans. We're actually using half of all renewable fresh water. And in fact, ecosystems are degrading rapidly, and agriculture became the most important influence on global Earth system processes. Actually, at the global scale. So here, just putting the RLC in perspective. So now, people say we're in amidst the Anthropocene, right? The planetary boundary concept. So planetary boundaries point to these, as a precautionary principle, they point to these environmental limits, such as land use change, climate change, freshwater use, and so on. And here, because water is one of the most important ingredients to growing food, I focus on the freshwater boundary called PB water. And I mean, boundary concept has a very clear message. Beyond our limits, there are severe impacts, and there isn't much room for conventional intensification. And interestingly, just recently, in the vein of integrating environmental limits with a social boundary, a social foundation, the Sustainable Development Goals came in, the 2030 Agenda of Sustainable Development, integrating this whole idea. And this is actually kind of a big deal, because for the first time, it is now legally acknowledged among all nations that environmental integrity is the foundation for social economic prosperity. And again, food production and the interaction with water is right at the heart of this agenda. So food production is targeted in SDG 2, for instance, end hunger and achieve food security, double agricultural productivity. But at the same page, it is also targeted as sustainable and resilient food production systems. So this makes kind of a non-trivial equation. And when we wanted to come in and also look at the water targets, such as sustainable withdrawals and protect and restore water ecosystems in SDG 6, this is definitely a complex and rather transformative agenda. So, and to put this perspective in relation to my work, we have two axes, that is food production and water use, and two challenges, that is to reduce the current overdraft on the y-axis, and then we note a significant food gap on the x-axis. And by 2050, we assume that we need approximately 80% more food production to achieve these goals. Right, so this is a simplified chart that will guide us through this presentation, and I can derive some quick research questions. So in the first part, I want to look at what does it take to respect the planetary boundary for freshwater use, and what is its status, and then what would be the implications for food production. So then in the second part, I want to look at opportunities. So what are the food production potentials within the planetary boundary for freshwater use? What are saving potentials in irrigation? What are potentials in more integrated strategies that we would also look at rainfed systems? And then in the end, combining both, and can water management maybe even reconcile implications of constraining, respecting environmental flow requirements, that's called EFRs. Okay. As far as it comes to methodology, I'm mostly basing my work on an agro-hydrological modeling framework. In this case, it's called LPJML. It's been developed in Potsdam, but also in other institutes. And the beauty of it, it combines an crop model and an agricultural model with an hydrological model at a high spatial and temporal resolution with about 67,000 grid cells. It's a dynamic representation of processes and so forth. Probably know about it. And to address these questions here in a better way, I implemented a new mechanistic irrigation module, but also a representation of environmental flow requirements. So to gain a little bit more trust in what we do here, a quick view on validation. This plot shows global discharge observations at GRDC guarding stations against simulated discharge, and the overall R² is beyond 0.99 with a little error bar associated with different precipitation inputs. But also crop yields look fine for the four major staples: wheat, rice, maize, and soy. The coefficient of variation ranges between 0.85 and 0.96. Charge symbols just scale with the national crop yield area. So that said, let's jump into it. So what's the, yeah?
Is that annual discharge?
Yes.
Okay.
Just a rough validation. We can look into variability later on if that's interesting. Okay, what's the status of PB water, and what does it take to respect it? So Rockström and colleagues, you know the paper, Planetary Boundaries, came up with an initial marker with a top-down, globally fixed approach of 4,000 cubic kilometers of consumptive use. So my group in Potsdam contributed to that study, but it's a little bit tricky because a global estimate for water use does not really reflect spatial disparities. because water use doesn't really balance out, right? For instance, carbon dioxide is well mixed, whereas water use, if you use it in one region, it doesn't mean that you can use the rest of it in another region. So I contributed to a study where we did a bottom-up approach of this planetary boundary, accounting for local flow requirements. And we come up with a significantly lower value, positioned now at 2,800 cubic kilometers. So these results suggest that our current water use of about 1,700 cubic kilometers might be much closer to the global boundary than previously expected. And yet, I mean, these global numbers are tricky, and when we talk about food production constraints, we want to stay local, and these global numbers have a political meaning, but not necessarily a lot of scientific scrutiny. So let's stick with...
Can I just ask a question on that last part?
Sure.
So what was the constraint? Was it a spatial, like it had to be nearby, or was it economically done in terms of why that extra 1,200 cubic kilometers could be used?
So in that study we accounted for local water requirements. And Rockstrom et al. Did just a global back-of-the-envelope calculation, right? Comparing global numbers. We have a global discharge of 40,000 cubic kilometers. 16,000 are actually available. Let's subtract 60% for whatever, so we come up with 4,000. So this is a very basic, rough assumption.
All right, whereas yours had more of a kind of...
And in the other study, we actually go into grid cells and calculate local water availability.
So it wasn't different rules, it was just the direction by which you
correct.
had there.
Yeah. And still, I'm hesitating to put out these numbers anyways. I mean, again, it's meaningful in a political context, and that's why the whole planetary boundary concept is so prominent. But for our studies, well, I don't relate to these numbers too much. So yeah, that's what I said. It doesn't really balance. So we stick with environmental flow requirements for now. Environmental flow requirements is the minimum river flow that needs to be maintained to protect aquatic ecosystems, right? So there are many different approaches to calculating it. Here I employ hydrologic methods that will associate different fractions of the pristine river flow to the flow requirements. And then if the current river flow transgresses these flow requirements, there is a high risk of regime degradation, and we speak of a flow deficit, right? And to represent an uncertainty range, I employ different of these calculation methods, so we come up with an uncertainty band. So that's the background, and when we compare it with local observations, simulations are surprisingly robust across different basins. And again, the R-square ranges between 0.85 and 0.95 for different methods. Just quick for the simulation protocol, that's straightforward. For this case, we compare current situation with a situation where we respect flow requirements and would stop human water withdrawals as long as they would tap EFRs, and base our research questions on these two scenarios. And I'll walk you through the rest later on. So this world map lays out regions where flow requirements are substantially degraded, most notably in southern and central Asia, northern China Plains, Mediterranean region, and also North America, among other regions. The human water withdrawal accumulates to 2,400 cubic kilometers for irrigation and about 1,000 for other uses. So this figure suggests that about 40% of irrigation water use is actually unsustainable and at the cost of ecosystems. When we look a little bit closer, Pakistan, for instance, represents a dramatic case where only half of the needed flow requirements are actually available, and there's a deficit for the whole year. but we also find significant breaches across many other rivers, you name it. Euphrates, Amudarya, Yellow, Rio Grande, Colorado. So generally speaking, the status of the water boundary is poor, mainly due to irrigation.
Jonas, I'm just curious, where do you get the data from? Like, in the rivers, are there something?
So this is all model simulations.
Oh, I see, okay.
And that's why I showed some validation plots. They are driven by precipitation data, of course.
I see.
And we compare model results to local observations. But to come up with these global estimates, this is truly simulation based.
Okay.
Right. So then the next question would be, what does it mean for food production if you were to respect these flow requirements? And again, that's the beauty of these modeling approaches, that we have a directly coupled model that can directly estimate food production potentials or the constraints. So if we were to implement policies related to the SDG 6, sustainable withdrawals, global food production would be significantly impacted. On about half of global irrigated area, the kilocalorie production would decline by 10%. And in hotspot regions, much more so, more than 20% of the total production, total means rainfed production and irrigated production together, rely on EFRs. Then, if we wanted to order it by country scale aggregation impacts, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Israel appear up front. And the bottom panel shows the cumulative country population, indicating that 2 billion people live in countries facing at least a 10% production decline. On global average, the last column, the global food production would be constrained by 5%. So, quick context, so we've seen 1,000 cubic kilometers are unsustainable and at the cost of ecosystems, and a 5% global kilocalorie production decline means that it is a 30% of the overall contribution of irrigation. Because if we switched off irrigation theoretically completely, the decline would be 15%. So this is a significant, 5% is a significant number. Now, I don't want to only focus on biophysical limits. So motivation is to work towards solution-oriented results. So the second part, we'll study some of the opportunities in that space. And field studies demonstrate that we have a rich portfolio of different measures at hand that can sustainably intensify food production. But this topic mostly revolves around soil fertility, and measures that I want to focus here, for instance, irrigation transitions, are less discussed, and rainwater management and also saltwater management are usually completely neglected. So related questions, what is the saving potential in irrigation, and what does it mean for food production? In general, irrigation systems are known to be leaky at the global average, and they have never been really well captured in global modeling. So saving potentials are usually based on subjective opinions, and to contribute in this direction on a more quantitative basis. I first grouped these various systems into the three main categories: surface irrigation, sprinkler irrigation, drip irrigation, and then implemented in a mechanistic way into our model. So now these processes are actually based on all kinds of factors: plant growth, soil quality, and of course the river flow, the water availability, and so forth. So for instance, here application requirements are now a function of soil type and plant growth and so on. So behind the scenes, rather that looks like this. So
Got
this
that
is
right.
just to test you if you whatever. The message is we have a framework that can simulate system transitions between surface, sprinkler, and drip irrigation, right?
Notice just from a
Sure.
bird's eye view, is this changing every year, like in a perfect farmer kind of standpoint, in terms of they know how much water there is and therefore they do the perfect irrigation, or are rules set before the season, or how does that?
Well, that depends on the irrigation map, right? This is only the infrastructure. So this is how the systems are modeled, and then if we come up with a scenario and say it's all perfect irrigation, we would come up with a map with drip irrigation everywhere and then tweak the irrigation parameters and stuff. But first of all, we tried to have a realistic assumption, to have a realistic representation of current irrigation system distribution and functioning. And that's what I showed on
And
the
that's
next slide.
something that you can change.
And
make
then
it
we have the
different.
infrastructure, the framework to study system transitions.
So this is probably an ignorant question, but how well do we know like the distribution of the different types of irrigation? Like like do you?
Not at all.
Okay. All right.
And it was one part of this publication to actually come up with the first global map of irrigation system distributions. And that's actually being used in other models now.
Oh, okay.
It's a combination of different data sets, country scale data, like this country has 3% drip irrigation and 20% surface irrigation, the rest is sprinkler, and then assign it to different crop types and then come up with in the end, it's a decision tree approach to assign it.
Cool, thanks.
Okay. So yeah, let's look at so yeah, it doesn't have a groundwater module, but it does have a representation of reservoirs, which is more important for these kind of questions. Groundwater abstraction is important for global numbers, not so much for our environmental flow question. Yeah, okay, quick simulation protocol. This is a bit more tricky. The second part involves more than 700 simulations, but here I only focus on the one marker scenario that I call ambitious yet feasible implementation strategy. And it assumes that drip systems are established where feasible, sprinkler irrigation is the default, and surface irrigation is only left for paddy rice. And then I also come up with an irrigation expansion using saved water to put it on neighboring fields. So, to the best of my knowledge, this is the first global map of gridded process-based irrigation efficiencies. And when we aggregate it, they compare well with previous studies, yet at a much better spatial, temporal, and of course process resolution. And looking at the map, we see Europe and North America stands out with high efficiencies, but the global average is only 33%, which means that only a third of the withdrawn water for irrigation is actually transpired by the crop. On another note, 50% of consumptive use, so the withdrawn water that is actually evaporated from open canal surfaces or from the soil or transpired by the plant, 50% of that number is actually lost and non-productively being used, right? So this is 600 cubic kilometers and is indicative of the saving potentials that we actually want to address. So the work that I've done indicates that with that kind of irrigation transition scenario, 40% of these losses might be accessible. And this is an important finding because usually the debate is kind of gridlocked and says, okay, at the basin level, saving potentials cancel out and they're marginal, so we don't really need to focus on irrigation efficiency improvements at the large scale. But it is true, I don't touch return flows, as they're indeed important for downstream users. But with the help of this mechanistic modeling approach, I can actually separate between return flows, evaporation, and transpiration. And I can show that here shown by the ratio of transpiration that we want to aim at and evapotranspiration, the total of all consumptive losses. There are significantly less evaporative losses associated with better irrigation systems. So this is a significant finding. And the question is, how does it relate to food production? Well, it is not surprising that if we redirected our saved water on the same field, we don't gain much, right? If we put the same water on the saved water on the same field, we don't gain much because current irrigation is usually not operated under water limitation. But the question is, how much would we gain if we use that water and redirect it to neighboring underperforming fields? And here's the true potential of irrigation savings. So if we put the water in the same grid cell on neighboring rainfed fields, global food production could be increased by 20%. And yet the saved water is not all of it is actually being used. Because this is an iterative process, right? This is just an indicative first scenario. So now that we've looked at irrigation, let's look at the rainfed farming as well. And when it comes to rainfed farming, it is often not the total rainfed availability, but precipitation variability that constrains farming most. And while we've seen the 33% in irrigation that is being transpired by the whole water in the system, in rainfed farming, it's 46%, indicative of excessive losses on the field. So that's actually the target. We want to address evaporation and surface runoff and redirect it and make it usable for the crop and increase our transpiration. So how can it be done in reality? One traditional measure is, for instance, soil moisture conservation that aims at alleviating soil evaporation, for instance through organic mulching, plastic films, but also agroforestry, conservation tillage, these kind of things. And then there is water harvesting that stores surface runoff, excessive rainfall, and uses it for supplemental irrigation during dry spells. And these measures are usually overlooked, and just recently Johan Rockström and Marlene Falkenmark urged for an increased awareness, which motivated me to study these on a more quantitative basis. Again, quick simulation protocol. So we study soil moisture conservation, where we assume 50% of soil evaporation is alleviated, and rainwater harvesting, where 50% of the surface runoff is collected, and then actually combine it with the irrigation studies and also look at climate change. But this is not the focus here, so we can look at it later if you want. So overall, at global level, soil moisture conservation might increase kilocalorie production by 7%, water harvesting by 18%, and global maps are interesting and show that regional potential is actually much higher, with potentials up to 30% in some regions. Soil moisture conservation mostly in water-limited, semi-arid regions, and water harvesting in regions with excessive precipitation.
Sorry.
Yeah.
How does water harvesting sort of gel with the? Because the very beginning you showed there was like a requirement for the river flow, right, or whatever it was called. Basically, how would water harvesting impact like the water resources downstream?
That's a great question. Thanks for being so sharp.
Okay, thanks.
I do have you've covered it already, so that's cool. I do have a slide for that. Shall we touch on it later on?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. I mean,
because the quick message is it does impact irrigation in the same grid cell or downstream. When we aggregate it to the basin level, it does not impact, and the overall food production is dramatically higher. Yet it will come with reallocations, right? Irrigation will suffer just a tiny little bit for big gains in the overall system.
Cool.
So that's a quick answer.
Yeah.
Okay. Now let's combine it real quick with the irrigation setup. And this is the overall ambitious, water management scenario, how to save the whole thing. And it does come with tremendous potential. So the overall global kilocalorie production could be increased by 40% without using additional water, without using additional land. And of course, it is mostly concentrated to water-limited regions, mostly Central South Asia, but also North America. So on the last 2 or 3 slides, I want to combine the second part and the first part of the presentation, and now combine things with maintaining EFRs and combine it with the water management in an irrigation only and an integrated scenario. Yet here, this is only a moderate, in this publication we only focus on a more moderate scenario and not necessarily these upper biophysical limits. So this lets me to combine this country level figure, and shaded mint green we have the irrigation upgrade scenario, where we in this time only assume that surface irrigation is replaced by sprinkler, yet paddy rice remains at the surface, and only 50% of savings are actually exploited for expanding irrigation. Then the more integrated options would also make use of soil moisture conservation and water harvesting, but at a lower rate. So, and not to our surprise, we see small gains in countries that have very efficient systems already, such as Israel, Spain, but huge gains are possible in countries like Pakistan, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, that have a prevailing surface irrigation system with unlined canal distribution and so forth. So at the global level, we see that only a shift in irrigation transitions can actually already outbalance constraints to environmental flows, and more ambitious scenarios can actually push this further. So yeah, a little bit of conclusion. We've explored different scenarios in this food-water sphere and led into 4 publications. Let's just quickly put them to the point. So irrigation has a potential to increase global food production by 20%. Then more integrated water management options can do 40% at this ambitious level. Yet climate change, that I haven't really shown here, will add an uncertainty range, but it will not dramatically reduce the overall potential. So the 40% roughly sticks across different RCP scenarios. And this means that water management has actually the potential to halve the global food gap by 2050. So then again, flow requirements will impinge on production, slight irrigation transitions can outbalance, and then more ambitious scenarios can push this. And again, these global numbers hide a lot of spatial heterogeneity. California, the Nile, and most prominently Central Asia and the Indus Basin still with minus 30% production. So this also suggests that food production reallocations might be inevitable in attaining sustainable development goals. So a little wrap up. All this is based on case study evidence. It appears feasible from a biophysical and an agronomic standpoint, and we only use global modeling capacity to scale across heterogeneous landscapes. And some of these measures are actually cheap and readily available for even the smallholder, and others, of course, require institutional changes, cultural shifts, big upfront capital investments. So still, this is the first systematic, comprehensive assessment of this topic, and it might be robust enough to stimulate a trans-boundary trade-off analyses, and can also catalyze local solutions and further refinements. And with respect to this, let's say, rather conceptual discussion of SDG interactions, it comes up with the first quantitative numbers. But still, it's only a starting point, and implementation of these things is way ahead and, of course, needs refinements. It's been cited as a sustainable benchmark for sustainable intensification, was highlighted and also mentioned in the Time magazine as today's best idea, whatever. So just a little context to this broader historical race for food. I mean, new innovations will certainly come up with technological fixes that will push the envelope. Let's maybe at one point we'll bring sunlight where fresh water is abundant, or the other way around, right? To generate fresh water where sunlight is abundant. But when faced with a scale of untapped opportunities in traditional farming, this, people call it a new green or double green revolution, appears to be above all an implementation challenge. And still, water management is not sufficient. It's not a panacea, and will integrate into the agro-hydrological landscape approach, using synergies and opportunities from other measures. And still, right, water is only one aspect, and we need much more research in devising viable pathways that have all the interactions actually of planetary boundaries to attain the sustainable development. All right, thanks.
Thanks, Jonas.